Hey internets, so what if I told you that it's entirely reasonable to treat entire branches of what's currently considered science with extreme skepticism, to the point where the conclusions that they draw really shouldn't be seen with much more authority than just a random coin toss? In this video, I'm going to explain why every rational person should be what is known as a hard science snob. And for those of you who don't know, hard sciences are things like physics, math, biology, astronomy, computer science, geology, chemistry, or even engineering. Things that more or less deal with how the universe works, whereas soft sciences are things more like sociology, psychology, and economics and political science. You know, things that are a little bit more about studying the human condition and thus have a bit of a philosophical edge to them. And what it means to be a hard science snob is that you effectively only really consider hard science to actually be science. It's basically the denial that soft sciences should really be considered quote-unquote science. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically don't trust the soft sciences. It doesn't mean you don't recognize them as legitimate fields of study. It just means you recognize that they don't really truly follow the scientific method, and it is thus entirely reasonable to treat them with more skepticism than you would treat the hard sciences, especially in this day and age where we have a lot of ideologically motivated garbage that often completely goes against basic logic and reasoning that is being peddled as science when in fact it's nothing more than just propaganda. And I'm actually going to be explaining how this problem is significantly worse than many other people who talk about it realize, as I'll be pointing out some very serious reasoning errors that exist in many of today's soft science that often goes completely unnoticed by a lot of the people who are criticizing. Because if you look into this, you may be able to find things like people talking about the replication crisis, or things like widespread p-hacking, and how it has a significantly higher chance of happening in the soft sciences, and also how common it is for those examples of academic fraud to have some kind of political bias or motivation behind. All very serious and very real problems, yes, but the rabbit hole actually goes deeper than that. And for those who are not new to my channel, another way to put it is that we're going to be going into sort of the more academic side of the equality fallacy, and how a lot of the social sciences are guilty of a very serious statistical reasoning error that makes all the current problems we already know about the soft sciences even worse, resulting in the world we live in today, which is a world where it's entirely reasonable to not necessarily trust sociology and psychology and whatnot research. And it's actually not science denial at all. The problem is it isn't really science. But before getting into things, this video's sponsor is private internet access. A lot of people unfortunately still don't quite understand why you need a VPN while using the internet. And it's often the same old fallacy of thinking that if you aren't doing anything wrong, then you don't need privacy. Yeah, no. This mentality will trap you in the mindset that it's perfectly fine for government and hackers to be able to effectively stand behind your back and watch everything you are doing. The reality is, whether it's those hackers trying to steal your identity, your credit cards, your passwords, and other personal data, or the surveillance state or copyright trolls, a VPN remains the best way to protect yourself from these problems at a cost that is significantly less than the danger of using the internet unprotected. Private internet access solves the problem for you by using RAM-only no-log servers and top-of-the-line encryption to mask your IP online and stop potential bad actors from stealing your info. Not only are they a top-quality VPN, but their app is stable, user-friendly, and available on all of your devices without limitations. PIA also comes with excellent downloading and upload speeds, tons of security features, and one particular favorite is that it is very streamer-friendly. They have servers all over the world you can choose from, and many of them are optimized for Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Disney and Paramount Plus, etc., etc. And you can use PIA to unlock the geo-restricted content on streaming services, allowing you access to a much wider variety of movies and TV shows. It is also very affordable. If you use my personal link in the description below, you can get private internet access now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, plus 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back, risk-free guarantee. Seriously, it's a good VPN, get it. Anyways, getting back into things, let's start out with some basics. So the general reason why soft science shouldn't really be considered science is actually fairly straightforward, which is that it doesn't really follow the scientific method. It comes very close, but there's a point in the scientific method where it kind of runs into problems. And that point is the point of peer review. Because the entire point of science is to make sure that things are measured objectively and tested in a controlled environment, specifically in a way that can be replicated and actually proven to others objectively. And we humans kind of came up with the scientific method in order to get around a very key problem or a key inherent flaw with the human condition, which is that humans can kind of be a little bit stupid at times. People can make claims like, oh, the reason the sun rises every day is because it's being punted across the sky by a demon, and those people can sincerely believe what they're saying. Now, of course, today we're fully aware that that's not the reason the sun rises every day, but back in the day before science, that kind of thing might actually spread. People actually might sincerely believe it because humans are kind of of biased towards believing these weird fantastical tales, motivated by emotional reasoning, even if they don't really make much sense, even when there's basically no proof behind. Now, the peer review process of this is important because it kind of serves as a quality check, a QA system for academic and scientific publishing, where other experts in the field can then evaluate research before that research is then published to the public. So in other words, it's kind of a gatekeeping where you have to convince people who are educated in the subject of your research before you start peddling it to others. And in the hard sciences and the soft sciences, this is where we kind of see a very big difference. Because in the hard sciences, it's entirely possible for hard science to be bogus, but it will eventually be found out. And the reason for this is because peer review isn't really a one and done process. You don't just manage to get published and that's it. What you're saying is considered valid scientific research, just forever, and nobody ever questions it. That's not how it works. Rather, peer review is continuous. If someone later finds out that some research is bogus, that research can actually get retracted, or in other words, no longer considered a valid study. Now, in the hard sciences, one thing that happens is that because it mostly studies how the universe works, what usually happens with the hard sciences is that you'll have a real physical product, some kind of device or machine, or some kind of general practical application, or some kind of process of the universe that can be observed, which objectively verifies the study or objectively verifies the theory. For example, in computer science, we know that the theory behind the logic gates and how they function is correct, because if they didn't function the way that computer scientists say they function, and the way that mathematicians and physicists understand it, then of course the device that you're using to watch this video right now wouldn't function. Or another example, say physics. If Einstein's theory of general relativity wasn't true, then we wouldn't need to adjust the clock speeds of satellites based on how fast they're moving around the Earth in order for GPS to correctly track your position. In fact, that's a pretty interesting example, because if we tried to have GPS work without knowledge of Einstein's general theory of relativity, then we would get these really weird tracking errors over time, and scientists would be completely baffled. Or perhaps an even simpler example, in things like chemistry, it's very easy to verify whether or not claims about a molecular compound caused by a chemical reaction are true or not, because you can mechanically demonstrate it to be true. You can just observe it and it's true. And so in this sense, the peer review process in the hard sciences kind of has this second hard verification, where the theories and claims are hard proven by some kind of practical application. That just wouldn't function if the theory was wrong. And soft sciences, they have kind of a problem. They don't really have this kind of hard verification. What soft science has instead is just almost entirely represented by data trends, with very few cases of actual practical mechanical applications of the theory. And so what you end up with is that the peer review process in the soft sciences is more or less just more like an arena of people who are experts in the field, allegedly, just kind of arguing and bickering with each other. And well, that's an issue because human beings are a little bit biased, even if you're an expert in a field. And so the things that don't really align with their biases tend to get nitpicked a lot harder than the things that do. And so they just kind of argue with each other whether or not the data really says and means what the researcher claims it means. And oftentimes that argument really just based on these biases. Because unlike the hard sciences, say in engineering and bridge building, where we would eventually find out if there's small errors in the data and reasoning, because, the bridge will end up collapsing due to some kind of flaw that they didn't think of. Again, because the soft sciences, they don't really have that, this observable dichotomy between a functioning bridge versus a bridge that collapses after a few years or so. That kind of hard verification just doesn't exist with soft science. And so the soft sciences are extremely susceptible to being driven entirely by ideologues. And this creates kind of a perverse incentive within the soft sciences to create studies and do research that actually affirm those biases. So if you're, say, a young researcher in the field of soft science, you're a lot more likely to get published by just telling the arena what they already want to hear. And over time, what has happened is that the fields of soft science have overwhelmingly become populated by people who subscribe to the ideology of wokeism. And by that, I mean people who look at differences between population groups and just kind of generally assume that the cause of any kind of difference, especially a negative difference, is entirely the result of discrimination, resulting in them aggressively pushing for DEI as a proposed solution to the so-called problem. And this also often manifests in them kind of adopting Marxist and socialist economic systems. And it's a lot sillier than a lot of people realize. For instance, a lot of professors in top universities who teach the soft sciences have a significantly higher than average chance to be just an open Marxist. And now, of course, the explanation for this, kind of the moketoid cope, is that the reason the soft sciences have this kind of far far-left woke bias to them is simply because reality has a bias towards them. They will claim that the data is simply proving their ideology correct. But it's actually not. I have an alternative explanation, which is that the way the soft science works is inherently biased towards the ideology of wokeism, not due to it having a reality bias, but due to an inherent major fallacy that is built into the way that a lot of soft science is conducted. And to showcase this, I'll just kind of give you an example of a very oversimplified study. Let's imagine that there is a city made up of red people and blue people, and they conduct a study in this city that shows that red people are significantly more likely to get rejected for a loan when going to the bank than blue people are. And it's a pretty big difference. It's a difference of 60%. And the study thus concludes that the banks are discriminating against red people. Now, of course, obviously, if you're familiar with this kind of research, you know that this is a very, very, very bad study. And the reason it's a bad study is because we haven't controlled for anything. We haven't looked at socioeconomic status, we haven't looked at average credit scores, we haven't looked at average cultural differences, we haven't looked at average education levels between these groups, we haven't looked at anything. Because if it can be shown to be the result of completely unrelated factors that make people less likely to pay back their loans, which can be isolated from the fact that one person is red and the other person is blue, then well, obviously the accusation of lay bigotry doesn't really hold much water. And let's just say hypothetically that we look at the factors in this hypothetical city of red and blue people, and the study actually somewhat reverses itself. Now it shows that blue people are slightly more likely to be rejected for a loan, and that bankers were actually giving red people a bit of a handicap. They were actually being more favorable to them considering the economic situation. And the issue that this mainly demonstrates is that when you don't control for something, it's kind of the same thing as saying, assuming all else be equal. Not controlling for a variable is mathematically equivalent to just assuming that the variable has the same value or effect across all the groups or components in your study. You are implying that the variable you didn't control for has no significant influence on the outcome. And so you just treat it as an equal constant that you don't really have to think about. And this tells us something very interesting, which is that bad research in the social sciences is more likely to create an outcome that aligns with woke ideology. This is the most important point of this video that really needs to be stressed and understood. The fact that so much research coming out of fields like sociology tends to have this woke bias to it is not evidence that the ideology of wokeism has truth to it. Rather, the exact opposite is true. The fact that so much of this research has that woke bias to it is actually proof that they aren't really doing their job. So it's actually evidence that a lot of this research is in fact being conducted very poorly and with very little thought given to what they're controlling for. The lazier a study is, the more likely it is to reach this conclusion, because woke ideology makes this assumption of equality all the time. I've gone over this in my videos on the equity fallacy, but more recently the equality fallacy. The equality fallacy is this Mott and Bailey between different arguments for equality. Some of those arguments are good and some of them are bad, and what happens is people will just kind of dance between the good and bad arguments in order to justify believing that equality is more real than it actually is. And so what happens is when you have a social scientist who subscribes to this kind of neo-Marxist woke ideology of just asserting equality, they're more likely to not control for these things. They're more likely to just assume that which aligns with their bias, which is the assumption all else be equal, and the presumption of tabula rasa, despite the fact that tabula rasa has been debunked. And so it's not so much that reality has a woke bias, but rather it's just social science studies that don't control properly for things are what actually just naturally has a woke bias. Because when you make this reasoning error of not accounting for a variable that is relevant to your study, then that just kind of naturally leads you towards the thinking that justifies woke ideology. Now, at this point, your average social scientist will cry foul at this video. They'll say, but we do control for these things. We control for differences between groups all the time. But the reality is, when you really consider just how many variables are out there in the soft sciences, you'll realize that it's actually kind of impossible to control for every single relevant variable in a social science study. Because the thing is, human action is very, very complex. The reasons for one person giving an answer on, say, a survey may completely differ from the reasons another person gives an answer on the survey. But of course, you can't actually empirically measure the thoughts inside someone's head, and so you don't actually know why people say things in, for example, social science survey-based studies. And yet, because of the clownery, we instead end up with this reasoning error that persists in the soft sciences. This empiricist fallacy of, oh, I can't measure this, therefore it doesn't exist, so they can't measure incentives or can't measure thoughts, so they pretend they don't exist, or they just pretend that they're not relevant. They just sweep the things they can't measure under the rug, thus implying that those variables have no statistical significance or are equal, and then proceed with their study anyway in an act that can only really be considered pretend science at best. And the thing is, when you critically examine a lot of the studies from the soft sciences, you start to notice just how common this reasoning error is. And so let's spend most of the rest of this video going over real examples. And let's start with implicit bias testing. And if you're not familiar with this, implicit bias is something that the wokes talk about a lot. It's this idea that we have these unconscious negative attitudes and stereotypes that are subconsciously influencing your perceptions and decisions in regards to people in ways that you aren't actually aware of. And so wokes often use this to prove their discrimination, equality narrative because it's the perfect unfalsifiable accusation. If someone accuses you of thinking a certain way, you can't actually objectively prove that you don't. But the real problem from a scientific perspective really just comes down to the implicit association test that they use to prove the existence of implicit bias. Implicit association tests, what they do is they have the participants categorize words and images into pairs of things like good and bad and black versus white. So it's whether or not you associate stereotypically good words with black people or white people. So for instance, it might pair the word joy with images of faces, and whether or not the participant views that as a black face or a white face. And because people on average tend to associate black faces with quote-unquote stereotypically more negative language, the test thus concludes that people are implicitly biased to that degree. Now, the problem with this test is that when you give people very limited information about a person, people have to base it on the best pattern recognition they have. And when we remember that tabula rasa is not a thing, immediate problems spring to mind. First off, black people and white people on average don't actually use language the same way. And this is kind of hinted by the fact that even black participants in implicit association tests tend to associate the black faces with more stereotypically negative language. It doesn't actually tell you what the person taking the test is actually thinking or why they're making those associations. They're just assuming that it's because of some kind of implicit negative bias. What if it's just completely external differences, such as the difference between African American vernacular English and the way, say, the average white person talks? If that was the case, then it wouldn't really be a negative stereotype that's causing this. And the thing is, the people who've designed the implicit association test, well, they don't actually control for that possibility at all. They just assume that it doesn't exist because you can't really measure that. You can't empirically measure those thoughts and reasons, so they just make assumptions about those thoughts and reasons. They don't actually have evidence that it is what they say it is. And indeed, when you look at other studies, implicit association tests seem to contradict what people are actually saying. For example, in a feelings thermometer rating of races in the USA, based on actually asking people how they feel about certain races, it shows that most people have an in-group bias. Very notably, African Americans have a pretty noticeable in-group bias. But in implicit association tests, blacks tend to also associate blacks with negative language. And so the most likely explanation is probably just differences in how we use language. And this is further confirmed by the fact that implicit association tests aren't really good and that they don't really have very good reproducibility. There's pretty good evidence to suggest that implicit bias and implicit association tests entirely come from a place on measurement error. For example, if you were to give someone the same test twice, if a test is a good test, then someone should generally receive the same score the same time. That usually doesn't happen, but usually a decent test, one that actually, tests what it thinks it's testing, a person who scores 80% once, they might score maybe 78 or 82% the next time. But if it happens very regularly that the same person scores 70% one time and then 20% the next time, then 50% the next time, well, that shows that there's probably something wrong with the assumptions that the test is making. And the thing is, the different factors that could be at play here are astronomical, because people from different ethnic groups, or people from different religious groups even, or people from different countries, or even different political ideologies, however you want to cut it, when you group people into these kind of limited categories, you can't just ignore basic differences that they have. Do those groups speak the same language? No. Do those groups eat the same food? No. There are cultural differences between nutrition. And guess what? You have to account for that, because we know that nutrition greatly affects how people think. And indeed, it gets further. Do those groups all have the same moral systems? No. On average, they don't. Do those groups value the same things in life? No. And so those groups are also going to have different incentives, which, by the way, most social science doesn't account for at all, period. And the reality is people are a lot more complex than social science is claiming. People think in hundreds of thousands of different ways, performing actions in hundreds of thousands of different possibilities, each branching into hundreds of thousands of different possibilities. You can't actually control for all of this. It is not actually possible to do. And so social scientists, what they do is they make these tests up and they just kind of assume all else be equal. They assume that the reason one person associates a white face with joy and a black face with smoke must just be the same reason that they're assuming for everybody else, because they can't actually empirically measure the thoughts in their head, and so they just assume it's equal. They just don't control for it. But that's honestly kind of a difficult one to understand. An easier example might be feminist studies. And this is something I already did an entire video on a long time ago for people who want to know this one in more depth. In things like the wage gap, we just kind of control for a few factors between men and women, but we don't control for differences in male and female incentives. Instead, social scientists just, again, assume that that's equal because they can't measure it. We just kind of ignore the fact that women are more likely to sexually select for men who are better able to procure resources, and that would thus give men a greater incentive to make more money. What social scientists do instead is they just kind of assume that men and women act and think exactly the same, and so they don't control for factors like that at all. Or in the rare cases that they do, it's always very superficial, a very surface level, basic look at the differences. But they're always downplayed and for the most part ignored. And so thus they conclude that the wage gap is due to, again, just discrimination, not because they actually have evidence for that, but because they didn't think of anything else. But now let's look at another example that tends to stump a lot of people, and that's callback studies. These are studies where the researchers will send out resumes for various jobs where the resume is completely identical, except one resume applying for the job has maybe a black sounding name, like Tyrone or Jamal or Lakeisha, and then the other resume just has a white sounding name, like Eric, James, Samuel, or Nicole or something like that. And a lot of people, when they first hear of this, oh, well, that completely controls for everything, because now it's just showing what they think of the name and nothing else. And the result of callback studies show that, yes, people with quote-unquote white-sounding names are indeed more likely to receive a callback for a job interview opportunity. But the problem here is that it actually doesn't control for a lot of external factors. For instance, one problem is that we're not really controlling for race here, we're actually controlling for culture. A black man can be called Samuel, and so it's conflating the difference between white and black as a race with the difference between white and black as a cultural group. And admittedly, that can be seen as a little bit dicey, but the problem is that in a resume, you're giving job opportunities, you're giving the HR department very limited information to go by. And so it's actually just a very similar problem to the implicit association test. When people have very limited information by which to judge an individual, they have to go by the averages they're aware of. And resumes, the first part of getting a job, they don't really tell you a whole lot. And this puts hiring managers in a bit of a pickle, and why they tend to be a little bit superficial when it comes to deciding who to call back and who not. They kind of have to resort to bean counting. They have to go by averages. And the reality is people from different cultural backgrounds tend to have very different traits just based on that cultural background. Many of those traits being traits that predict job performance. And there's very good evidence to show that people from different cultural groups on average do not have this same performance. And while it's true that this may be unfair to the individual, the solution to this isn't to just cry mud discrimination, because when hiring managers do this, they're just going off the limited information that they have. And well, there's a very big problem when it comes to hiring and job performance, which is the existence of affirmative action. If you know that someone from Group A is protected by laws that in some cases will guarantee that they get a job, then this means that the job experience they have may not actually be valid. It's something I kind of explained earlier in the main problem with DEI. When you have DEI hiring, then that just shows from a statistical probability that if someone's a diversity hire, they're probably not as competent at their job. And so that's another completely different factor to consider when it comes to callback studies that completely flips the conclusion on its head. What if the reason that employers consider experience to be less important on the resumes of minorities is actually because we've made it easier for certain minorities to achieve certain qualifications? Like, for example, in education. We know for a fact that at least in the United States, minorities are more likely to get accepted into institutions of higher learning, even when they have lower grades and lower test scores. And it has been proven that this is entirely due to DEI initiatives. And if we push this kind of ideology to extreme, it's pretty easy to demonstrate the problem to the average person. For example, imagine if again we had a city of red people and blue people, and then imagine some wokes in the city gain institutional power and then gain some political power, and they decide to solve the problem of the fact that red people are significantly less likely to have college diplomas. Their brilliant solution to that is to just give every red person a college diploma. Just require everybody in the city to just give them whatever credentials they need. And so then imagine that you're a hiring manager in this city. Do those credentials amongst red people hold the same value to you? No. In fact, the irony is the law mostly screws over any red people in the city who legitimately achieved those qualifications. Because you as the hiring manager, you don't know the difference. You wouldn't be able to tell which of those credentials was real and which was fake. And so that just kind of brings up the question, is the reason why employers are, say, 20 to 30% less likely to call back a minority because they have bigoted feelings towards that minority? Or is it because the state has unwittingly created a world where the same qualifications do not actually mean the same thing between different population groups? And again, social scientists have no way of knowing which is true. They can't actually empirically measure the thoughts inside HR's head when they're looking over these resumes. Soft scientists do not actually know these things based on the data. They just assume that their assumptions are correct. Not by, again, any kind of real physical product or practical application, but instead just by arguing amongst each other. But I think one that really stands out, that really shows how a lot of social science is just entirely fraudulent, are the studies that look at sentencing disparities in different population groups. And these are studies that look at people by gender, by nationality, by religion, and by ethnicity, etc., and see who gets harsher punishments for allegedly the same crime. And of course, when you look at these studies, you'll notice something's very, very strangely absent from the control, which is that because it's almost impossible to account for differences in behavior, and by that I mean differences in these kind of subtle qualitative factors in how different groups on average tend to conduct themselves while in a courtroom, and how good of arguments they make, and whether or not they use reason or how they use reason, these studies never account for that. Which again is ridiculous, because we know people from different cultural groups don't necessarily use language the same way. Again, there's thousands of factors that go into this, and they just don't control for that. They just presume tabula rasa, presume blank slate, presume that they're all acting and behaving the same way in front of the judge. Which is absolutely insane, because we know that subtle little differences in how someone conducts themselves in front of a judge will have an impact on their sentencing. There's no way to get around that. It's just the human condition. People are different. People think different things. Every single court case is different. There's thousands of millions of different possibilities of what's going through these people's heads during these court cases and how they're communicating those thoughts to each other in their argumentation for their case. And so their response to the difficulty of controlling for those factors is that they just don't control for them. I wish I was joking, but this is unironically the methodology by which most social scientists go by. This is what a lot of sociology papers are. Oh, look, these qualitative factors are too difficult to measure, so we're just going to pretend like they don't exist. And I'm sorry, but it's just obviously not science. That's another thing that really needs to be stressed here. Hard science snobbery is not a rejection of economics and sociology and psychology and whatnot. They are very important fields of study. The problem is that the scientific method that works for the hard sciences doesn't really work for the soft sciences. So it's actually not just an issue of peer review being easily influenced by ideologues when you don't actually have any kind of physical application to show off in support of your theory. The problem is actually that the soft sciences are significantly more complex, because they deal with things like human action, which deals with things like human thoughts, and human beings can have hundreds of thousands and millions of different reasons for why they may give a certain answer to some kind of sociology survey. And while those are obviously very relevant variables, the problem is you can't actually control for them. It's not possible. There's too many of them out there. And so the result of when you just kind of uncritically transfer the methodology from the hard sciences to the soft sciences, as Murray Rothbard complained about, you end up with something that ironically isn't actually science. Because the reliance from the hard sciences on hard empirical data, it doesn't really work, as the soft sciences have too many variables. And so in the soft sciences, to create correct scientia or correct knowledge, you have to rely more on logic and reasoning. Otherwise, you're just kind of stabbing in the dark, controlling for maybe 4 to 6 variables out of possible millions. And it really doesn't work. Another thing is, I'm not making the claim that racism doesn't exist here. I'm not making the claim that discrimination is never a thing. The problem is, it likely doesn't exist to the extent that sociologists claim it does, because the problem is, currently the social sciences, they look at these things and they just assume lay bigotry as the standard, default, go-to conclusion. They never consider the possibility of any other rational reason. They just say, oh, people are acting lay bigoted, and there's no reason as to why. There's hardly any consideration for anything else. And this is a problem, because all of the studies I just mentioned, you may have noticed I wasn't really talking too much about specific studies. I gave a few specific examples, but a lot of this is general. And the reason why it's general is because these studies I've mentioned, they're actually very commonly used to shape society and shape policy. And that's a thing that really needs to be emphasized here. This video is not cherry-picking the worst of the soft sciences. Rather, I've intentionally cherry-picked just the opposite. I've cherry-picked examples that are considered the most influential for current modern-day policy as a result of what the soft sciences are telling us. And things like implicit bias or wage gaps between different groups and things like callback studies, these are all very famous studies. And there's more than one of these studies. There's a lot of studies that double down on them. And, well, they all commit similar fallacies. They are all guilty in some way or form or another of this assuming all else be equal mentality, where the more difficult something is to measure, or the more difficult it is to even consider the possibility, the more likely it is just not considered at all in the soft sciences. And this This is where a very big inherent flaw of the soft science is revealed. Do we really have any proof at all that a lot of it isn't just an extremely complex circular argument? What if the peer review process for soft science is just taking this assuming all else be equal mentality, and they use it to justify belief in woke ideology, which is then used to further justify the bias of assuming all else be equal? Well now, that would be a pretty big problem, wouldn't it? Because that would mean that a lot of the soft science is simply bogus. It's just a massive circle of ideologues sniffing their own farts. And often, when you point out these possibilities, these other potential rationalizations that are actually justified as an alternative to their lay bigotry conclusion, that's when the Mott and Bailey dance tends to flip. They kind of drop the mask that they actually care about science, and then they start relying more on their moralistic arguments and shaming arguments and trying to cancel you, trying to get any scientist who suggests even the possibility that there is an alternative explanation to these disparities other than lay bigotry and lay discrimination, especially if it's from the HBD crowd. They stop pretending for it to be about data, and it becomes very obvious that it's all about ideology. Because ultimately, in the end, they don't really care. The reality is, a lot of social science is just used to justify belief in socialism and communism. The whole race thing is really just smoke and mirrors. It's just easier for them to trick your average normie by walking up to them and pointing out cherry-picked examples of how capitalism has allegedly disproportionately harmed minorities than it is for them to tell that liberal normie why they should be a communist. And that's what they really want to do. They're really just pushing socialism and communism and using this false claim of anti-racism and these bogus studies of lay bigotry as a mask that they wear to just kind of confuse the normies. And so therefore, a lot of it is also just activism disguised as science. When we constantly see this at some of the most popular and well-known and most influential examples of the soft sciences, well then, that is why it is entirely rational to be a hard science snob. It's not science denial, nor is it claiming that those fields of study have no value. They absolutely do. The study of human action is probably one of the most important studies we can have. And so the true state of being a hard science snob isn't denial of those studies as fields of science, but rather it's a question of methodology. Because the real problem here is that the soft sciences are actually more complex than the hard sciences. And so thus when you try to use the same methodology as the hard sciences, an empiricist methodology that focuses on control, it doesn't really work because it's not really possible to control for everything. And so being a hard science snob is more or less saying that the soft sciences should be focused more on logic. They should be focused more on philosophically reasoning things out, and then seeing what kind of conclusions you can draw from that. Because this attempt to focus on empirical data like the hard sciences do, which works perfectly fine for the hard sciences, it doesn't really work because what happens instead is that empirical data that is just too difficult to measure ends up just getting completely forgotten about and not measured, which is just obviously not a valid methodology to determine what is the correct knowledge. And that is, after all, the definition of science, scientia, correct knowledge. That is what the term is supposed to mean. And in the current methodology that we use for things like sociology, psychology, and economics and whatnot, a methodology that doesn't put enough focus on logic, well, it just can't be considered science. And that's all I really have to say on this matter for now. But one thing I really want to see in the comments for this video is just see how many other people out there, how many of you guys have seen these studies out there, and you know that they don't actually make any sense. So just kind of feel free to share examples of social science buffoonery. But other than that, that is all for this video. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, etc. And if you really like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again, by checking out private internet access. But for now, that is all. Thanks for watching, and till next time.